All right. If you allow me, and I'm sure that you will, I want to start with an auth 2 update. There's been some movement in auth 2. There are some very interesting feature requests that are coming in, especially regarding single sign-on, which is kind of very interesting and important when you're dealing with omni-channel kind of authentications. And in particular, there are two directions at the same time. One is a custom or homegrown single sign-on that I think that we talked about, and it's in the Content and Knowledge Hub. There is a link to explaining the technical details, but basically what it does is it adds some private claims into the JWT that Simple Auth exposes, and you can use that. They explain the setup in order to do that. So we had to add the ability to include custom and private claims for the JWT. Luckily, the underlying library allows all that. It was just a matter of exposing an alter hook, so it was pretty easy. So you can now do that. You can put whatever you want into that token and get it passed around, and then you decrypt it, and that's it. Like, you have that information passed around to whatever layer you want to do this kind of magic. The other approach, which is also very, very promising, is using a standard for this that is gaining a lot of traction, which is OpenID Connect. And I know OpenID, Drupal, kind of a history there, but it's I was reading a little bit about it. I didn't know beforehand, and I've only read about it. Seems solid. I like the approach. It uses a lot of standard stuff, and like JWTs on top of auth for the flows in order to acquire the token, and then there are some like just it's a contract on some of the how it works. It works on passing an ID, a token ID, and then on there you can have different scopes, etc. There is some standard stuff that you need to comply with, and Sasha Berdier is working on an implementation of that. So he's been spearheading all this, and I think it's a very interesting thing to have a solid single sign-on solution that we can say, hey, click this together, configure it this way, and that's how we do it in Drupal. So I don't know, I'm pretty excited about that because there hasn't been much movement in the auth 2 module, and lately there are some very interesting patches and feature requests. So that's one. I don't know if any of you have any reactions to that one.
No, except cool.
Yeah. Right. So basically, we could now, if we wanted to, replace bakery and have support for things that don't have necessarily cookies and work it across the whole ecosystem with the standard, and all that comes with like libraries and support, etc. The other one is also regarding auth 2, and it is the ability to skip the annoying redirect that you get, that your browser pops up and says, do you authorize this app to access these kind of things in your Drupal site? So some sort of skipping that if you already gave permission in the past. So kind of a remember me sort of thing. Like if you already approved that, even though your token has expired, you kind of just want to remember that option. So that's the other feature. And if anyone is interested in working on that, I think we are kind of spinning a new issue for it because it was kind of conflated into another feature request, which is having automatically trusted consumers. So when you add a consumer in simple auth, the system assumes that it's a third party, like someone came in and registered that, and it doesn't give extra trust to it. So we fixed or we allowed to introduce the concept of third-party consumers in the consumers module, which simple auth is based on. And now we are going to skip some authorization steps based on if this is a trusted consumer, meaning that someone had access to the admin pages and said, this is a trusted consumer. Then we are going to skip that step. And we are going to authorize that trusted consumer, like could be an iOS app, to gain access to some of the things. If the user said so. So I think that's all of it. It's kind of a weird blur if you're not, I guess, you're not familiar with these issues. But yeah, there's movement in that queue, and that's exciting. And with that, so that's kind of the an update in that front. With that, I think that I'd like to give Wim or Gabe the chance to give the JSON API update, because you guys have been doing the bulk of the work. But before you do that, I'm going to say that I'll be tagging after this call. I wanted to do it before this call, but I just got here. So after this call, I'm going to be tagging 1.8. And that's going to be released, and it comes with a lot of good things. So I'm excited about it, and I wish I had more time to write awesome release notes as the patches that are going out deserve. But probably it's going to be a list of commits. But yeah, let's celebrate and let's talk about the stuff that got in.
So for me, the things that I worked on that are really important for JSON API to move forward are test coverage, essentially. And so I ported the REST test coverage that we completed. So we reached 100% integration test coverage, which means testing the same sorts of edge cases and scenarios and ensuring that developer experience is great in various scenarios for every entity type. So we now have that same test coverage for JSON API, ported as close to one-on-one as possible. So it's changed as little as possible, essentially, but still adapted to what JSON API does and supports. Only for individual requests in JSON API parlance, so in the individual entities or resources being requested. Gabe is working on expanding that to support JSON API specific capabilities, such as collections and filtering and so on. But so that means that for the first time, we now will know for JSON API when either a change in JSON API or a change in Drupal core does change some responses for JSON API. So in other words, when there is a potential regression, or in any case, a change, and we know more bugs that we were not aware of that we can now fix. And so basically the test coverage just gives us a nice cushion, a security, the assurance that we can iterate faster without being afraid to break things. That's a highlight for me. But Gabe has also been working on other stuff. So Gabe.
Sorry, I was focusing on the different browser window. Yeah, I've been working on the internal stuff. That's all wrapped up as of 2 days ago. Or was it yesterday? I'm not sure. And now I'm working on, as Wim said, the filtering complex use cases for testing. But I also just finished rewriting or adding a significant addition to the docs for filtering. So that shows how we do our fancy filters and tries to give it a lot more explanation and hand-holding to make it easier for people to approach that.
Yeah, I'd like to talk about that separately because that's another really good thing that happened this week. Because you also worked on pagination, right?
Yeah, that's true. That might have been the week before.
Oh, okay. Then it might have fallen through the cracks for last week. I don't remember talking about this. But documentation it's pretty solid. I think it was pretty solid before, and now it's just really, really good. So yeah, that's really cool. I don't know if all of you know this, but Fred, I think that's news fresh from the album. But the possibility to make internal entities in Drupal core or make Drupal core respect the scope has been moved from 8.6 to 8.5, which means less juggling into detecting what version of Drupal core we do in JSON API, which I think it's good.
And GraphQL, by the way. And
GraphQL, yes. I'm curious, Philip. Do you plan on supporting internal entities, and do you already have support for that?
We do not have support for that yet. We've been focusing on other issues in the last weeks. But yeah, we definitely will support it.
Excellent. Wonderful. That's exciting because the release that Matteo is going to tag after this call, maybe after his run, I don't know. In any case, hopefully today, that is going to include support for internal entity types. So entity types that should not be exposed via HTTP APIs. And JSON API and REST will then be on par in that respect. But GraphQL isn't yet, so it would be great to have it on the same page. But JSON API doesn't yet support internal fields, so fields that are marked as internal. And actually, as of this morning, that has become even more important because in Drupal 8.5, we have a lot of improvements with regards to content moderation and revision handling and whatnot. And in order to achieve or to work around certain problems and fix certain problems, the entity field API maintainers saw it fit to add a new field called revision_default to every revisionable entity type. And so in other words, ta-da, 8.5 is going to be released with a new field on every revisionable entity type, which is many of the prominent ones, such as Node, for example, but also Commons and so on. And so that is going to impact every one of us, REST, JSON API, and GraphQL. The problem is that it was never actually discussed what the impact would be for HTTP API, so core REST, but also JSON API and GraphQL. In other words, ta-da, it's there, but what the hell does it mean? What can I do with it? It's not clear. It's not clear from the name. Does it mean it's setting a default? Does it mean it is the default? Like how to interpret it? Can you actually only read it? Can you also set it? It's all up in the air. And so we started having a discussion about that the middle of January, but it was sidelined and was postponed on critical bug fixes in the area of revision and translation and content moderation stuff. And so even though there were ideas of how to make that a more sensible field, it didn't, like, only a few days ago, it became, like last Friday, it became possible for us to start working on that again. So basically to clarify what the semantics are of the revision default field, because today it is a customly stored computed field, which means you can actually only read it, but it could be modified to also be writable and whatnot. But that's, of course, a can of worms that need to take some time to get to consensus to. And so and by the way, RC is going to be tagged tomorrow of 8.5. So in other words, we would have had from Friday until Monday evening, essentially, to fix this and figure out a solution that works for every use case, which doesn't seem like a great idea because it would have been rushed. So the solution has been to mark that new field, revision default, as internal. which is the thing I was getting to via a long-winded way, which hopefully gave useful background info. So that's the first case of a field that is actually not an obscure field. Well, it is kind of obscure maybe, but it is a field that's present on many common entity types in any case. So it will affect all of us very visibly. And the solution is to just mark it as internal for now, which means that it will not be exposed by REST. Very soon it will not be exposed by JSON API, and hopefully it will also not be exposed by GraphQL, because it is not going to be clear at all for end users what to do with the meaning of that field. So it's becoming more important is a key thing here, to respect the internal flag. Does that make sense, Matteo and Philip?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay,
yeah,
well,
totally. And before you were going to say that, I was thinking that we already have this ability in JSON API extras, but it doesn't come like it doesn't come from the entity definition. It's something that you have to do on top of.
yes.
And also, JSON API extras doesn't allow you to do easily. It allows you to do it, but it's not easy to just remove parts of a complex field, like properties on a complex field, and the internal flag applies to like all of the levels of the entity, including the properties on a complex field. So JSON API extras will continue to work as usual, but it will probably get a version 2.0 or 2.x at some point that leverages all of the easy internal and provides a UI, maybe through a separate module to set the easy internal, regardless of if you use it for JSON API or GraphQL or whatever. You could have a UI that you drill down and
exactly.
say. So I think it could be a win for all of the three main. I don't want to call them the main projects, but the three projects that are represented here. But in the meantime, JSON API extras just works just like it used to.
Yeah.
Shouldn't be broken for this. There is another thing that's breaking it, and we're working on fixing that. But
so actually, is that something we want to talk about today, or maybe some other time? Is what do we jointly, REST plus GraphQL plus JSON API, feel is a good way of representing this to the end user? I suspect, well, I know that for REST it has been asked before. For JSON API, well, it's something in JSON API extras. For GraphQL, it is something that is maybe a little bit less important, but also still important, because in GraphQL you specify which fields are the ones that you want always. But the thing is, it still shows up in the schema, which means that when you're writing your query, it's still there to confuse the developer who's writing that query, as in, what the hell is this revision default thing doing there? So just checking, Philip, do you also feel like this would be a valuable thing where you would be able to have a UI that is a separate module that is something called like, I don't know, internal fields, something, better name to be found yet, but that allows you to affect all three? Like, is that something GraphQL you would also like to see for GraphQL?
We kind of have this in plan for GraphQL, since Sebastian was also experimenting with the configurable schema, where we can like disable fields and properties from a UI or from some configuration.
Mm-hmm.
So you can really customize the schema to every shape you want.
Yeah.
And this kind of fits the same use case, but it's it would work across full GraphQL, and it would be on top of the internal property.
Yes. But it sounds like, because JSON API, for example, also has that ability to, for example, alias fields, give it a different name that is more sensible. So instead of field underscore blue blah blah, you could rename it to simple thing to make it much more clear. And so what you're describing just now seems to be also supporting those more advanced cases where you do aliasing and whatnot. And so that's where there is a difference. But would you be able to layer it on top of this generic module that just flips on the internal flag for entity types and fields? Or is it something that you see as completely independent?
It's independent. It would just cover a similar use case.
Okay.
You could just turn off a field, basically.
Mm-hmm.
But the main benefit is, as you said, renaming fields or even reducing the structure of certain
hiding certain properties, essentially.
Yes, renaming them, and also like pre-traversing lists. So I could have a list of entities that I'm requesting, and I immediately pull out just the one property I need, and I get just get the list of properties, like reducing the tree.
Okay. Okay. So I think maybe at some other time we should get together specifically about this. I can write a proof of concept module that does this, and then before putting it on Drupal.org with a particular name, I think JSON API and GraphQL maintainers should get together and figure out how it is that it makes sense for them to coexist with this extra module. Or maybe we just don't want this extra module. Maybe we just say, well, screw Drupal core's rest. JSON API will have JSON API extras, and GraphQL will have its own thing. And that's enough. Like, I just want to make sure that we don't create more confusion by having yet another module. There's only a subset, but you actually are never recommended to use it if you want to do something more advanced. You know, I wanted to actually be improving the ecosystem as a whole, or probably otherwise we shouldn't have it at all, because it's going to just give more options, and then it's going to be more difficult for people to figure out how to do what they need to do.
I wouldn't. So when I suggested that approach earlier, I wouldn't think to add that as an additional thing. I would say I would just add a dependency on JSON API extras on this thing that is shared across GraphQL, core, and whatever. So it would be just the configuration screen, and you go and disable stuff. You want to rename, maybe through form alters, or maybe in a different screen to keep things cleaner or whatever. But I agree, it should be, if it's a new thing, it should be just a dependency and not yet another module that you know that you need to go and download and install separately. Maybe for core, you would do that because there is no UI. Well, maybe REST UI could depend on that, add that dependency, right? So.
Well, I don't think you would want to depend on REST UI if you're installing JSON API or GraphQL.
No. What I mean is that there are different UI configuration modules for the different projects, and those should depend on this base module, maybe. But yeah. I think I'm in. I mean, I'm up for it to talk a little bit more about this topic. This is something that came up during the coupled Drupal days. I don't remember the name of the event. It's the event that happened last summer in New York City, and in talking with Michael from Amazy, we kind of thought that JSON API extras, at least the UI and the things that we are doing there, it applies almost completely to some of the goals of GraphQL. And that is the renaming, the enabling and disabling, and also the ability to provide post-processors and pre-processors. And I know that GraphQL is a little bit more flexible in that, because it kind of allows you to request from the client which processors you want to apply to a particular field, which is super cool. And I've always wanted to implement that. JSON API, I never got around it. But we already have a UI. So talking about this and kind of, coalescing efforts into that, I think it makes a lot of sense. And we talked about that, but things get in the in the mix
So-
and never got around it.
Would it be possible for, does GraphQL already have this, or are you planning to create it, Philip?
Well, GraphQL has field aliasing, but not in the way we talk about it.
Okay.
So the field itself that the developer needs to know the name of, this name is fixed. But the GraphQL query allows you to...
Right, query aliasing.
Yes.
Yeah. So Matteo is definitely talking about renaming it and pretending to the outside world as if the name is not field foo, but pretending the name is field bar, for example.
No, this is not there yet. So that's on the long-term goals, but not for the first release.
Of course, but that's perfect, I would say, because it sounds like perhaps rather than continuing to develop JSON API extras in a certain direction, maybe what we can do is, instead of creating a version 2 of JSON API extras, what we can do is build something that is actually working for both JSON API and GraphQL, because you both need essentially to store metadata for each field of how you want to rename the field. And you both need to store data of, or you need a UI to mark certain fields or entity types as internal. And you both have the ability to have processors. So maybe there is a opportunity there to not have what is mostly duplicate code. I'm not sure, but I think we should definitely look into it to avoid duplicate effort.
I think that the isInternal flag kind of gives us the foot on the door to say maybe we want to have a, I don't know, an API name for a field name, or just for type data that has a name. Maybe we could have an alias API, whatever name we want to call it, and then it would be like.
Then it would be standardized as well.
Yeah. Maybe
I'm plus one to that.
All right.
I think we should then check if there aren't any, like, are there other things like that we would want? Just aliasing, it seems like a very common need. Makes sense. Let's do it. Let's make it happen to have that common foundation and it's storable in Drupal core config. Is there something else like that? I think we should ensure that we're not, or maybe that is just the most important thing, and then whatever is JSON API or GraphQL specific can still happen in their own way. But it would be great if there are other things that we can propose not to do just an API name thing, but maybe something else as well. I can't think of anything, but maybe Philip or Matteo can.
I think post and pre-processors are like a very good generic thing. It's something that is slapped at the very end, even after normalization, something that you do a final transformation to, I don't know, remove or transform, or maybe you hate ISO dates and you want to have the weird American format. Sorry, American friends. Like something that you can do there. Or maybe you're just tired of having to give support because someone gives you, I don't know, timestamps instead of ISO dates. You want to have a pre-processor that whenever someone sends data in, it goes through that and assign it to a field. So those are cases that we have in JSON API extras. It gets more interesting than that. For instance, if you have a link field, it kind of turns it into a UUID-based link. Exactly, change normalizers. Thank you, Gabe. And you could stack them if you wanted to. That would be kind of a more advanced use case, but something very simple that at the end of the chain, it does a simple transformation. It expects scalar, like string, a number, or whatever is at the end of normalizing, and transform it into another one. And the other way around, when data comes in, it transforms it back. And since it knows about the transformation, it can also transform the schema that is shown to the rest of the world. So we call that field enhancers. I know that naming is probably terrible, but that's kind of the plugin type that we expose in JSON API extras, and it's been proving very useful for things like enhance entity : / entity ID, which is not very helpful for other people, but then they can transform that in something that makes sense based on UUIDs for using JSON API to synchronize to data hubs, things like that. So I think that's kind of another use case, and I think that GraphQL will have that need or may want to consider it as well.
Yeah, the architecture that we have in mind is in line with this. So the idea is to have fields that basically consist of a list of processors or resolvers, as we call them. And this changes the output type of the field, obviously, and can change it in any way. So you can turn an integer field or a string field into an entity by loading the entity type with this ID and doing this kind of stuff. So this would be the same idea. Just one thing is that we are GraphQL is not restricted to type data. So we need the ability to also do this for all other data sources that we build on.
That's interesting. So you're saying it's not the input and output is not defined based on type data types. It is kind of like more primitive types, like it's a string, but a string of this kind of shape, that sort of thing?
No, I'm saying that the GraphQL schema is not just built on type data.
Right, but that means that these processors also need to work for non-typed data things. So they need to somehow detect.
The processor has an input type that it can consume.
Okay, so there's still a type, but it's not a type data type, is what you mean, yeah? Yeah. But then JSON API already needs to solve or JSON API extras, field enhancers already need to solve this same problem in some way, because they too need to. They also are not tied to type data types, as far as I know. They are typed, or they can express what kinds of things they expect or accept as input and what they can provide as output. But I don't think there's metadata for it yet. I think it's defined in code, essentially.
Yeah, and at this moment is the implementer's responsibility to make their site not blow up. So,
yeah, and so GraphQL is probably more protective in that way, because it's
yeah. I think that the concerns that, or not the concerns, the comments that Philip was adding is something that in Node.js the Apollo team resolved as, I think, no, it's not schema stitching. It's what's the name? Well, you can have a static schema and then have references to processors and kind of bind them together with GraphQL tools and have that more interesting stuff. So maybe type data could be the static schema, the plain text schema, if you allow me, and then the processors could be stitched into those.
Yeah, I was more referring to the UI use case.
Oh, okay.
UI that would probably just list all the type data properties and entities that we have, and then you can disable and rename fields. This we could use this, just read this information and incorporate it into our type data derivers. So this would work. But we still would need something else on top of it for everything that we expose that doesn't come from type data.
As in, you need a UI still for the other stuff, whereas JSON API, for example,
we can like somehow make it work together, so we have one UI.
Yeah.
Like if we have, I have plans for example, extending the GraphQL JSON module in a way so you can feed it an open API specification, and it turns it into a schema, and you can just query with GraphQL whatever this OpenAPI API exposes to you.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah, that's very cool stuff.
So
Very
these are
exciting.
ideas, and this wouldn't work. Then it's completely different from type data.
Yeah, yeah. I've had the same temptation to do that in the past. Never got around it because of what you say, the disconnect of I really want to stay married to the concept of type data. So like making this marriage happen is kind of quirky, but many cool things happen when you have like a good open API schema. Like you can slap that into API gateway and have AWS fronted and scale and have some other use cases and treat Drupal as a microservice and things like that. So yeah, I would be really excited to see that happening.
So do we see, the reason I brought this up is, do we see the potential for GraphQL and JSON API to collaborate, to share code, to share a UI perhaps, or do we think that maybe it is not going to make sense because of GraphQL's ability to ingest not only, or ingest non-Drupal data essentially, or do we think that indeed for those more special cases, for example, ingesting an OpenAPI spec and exposing them that via GraphQL, only for those use cases, GraphQL would need its own UI and module, perhaps. But for the most common use case, which is exposing Drupal data, JSON API and GraphQL could share such a module. What are we thinking?
This whole idea, Sebastian and Fago already discussed this like 2 years ago, I think. Because it goes into the direction of this Drupal data graph they were envisioning. And this would be actually below type data, or type data would expose parts of this data graph. But it could be anything else. And then we would have like a configuration or a modification UI for this whole data graph. And this could be consumed by JSON API, by GraphQL, by REST, by anything. So this idea kind of already exists, but it wasn't pushed forward.
Sure, but do we want to push it forward or not? That's kind of the question, I guess.
I think that it's worth considering it. What I think I remember from those conversations is that it touched some of the fundamental cornerstones of Drupal 8. And it was like a significant change, like doing it below type data. If we do it sides to type data, it's more likely to happen and safer. But like I think that maybe the correct way of fixing this is as it was expressed by the GraphQL team. But practical me says it's very difficult that it's going to happen in that sense. So have some conflicted feelings on that, but I'm on board with the idea. I think that with type data and adding this as a, adding it at the side of type data, like adding new dedicated fields, it can help GraphQL to derive most of this for their schema, and then they will need to figure out how to do it for the rest of stuff. I don't know, image derivatives or breadcrumbs and things like that, that I don't think that are based on type data.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think it's worth adding an issue and see that it shouldn't well, I'm not going to say it. It's worth adding an issue.
Yeah, I just wanted to, I think we've gotten to a point where it's worth discussing this because it is now within reach, whereas before it was more of an abstract idea of some distant future. Now it's no longer a distant future, so we should talk about it and consider it to save effort.
Yeah. Cool. We are wow, we're 13 minutes past the half-hour mark, but I think that this was one of the most productive things that we've had, and we got a lot of good news. We missed GraphQL's good news, but I'm sure that Philip can give us the news of GraphQL pretty quick, if possible.
Yeah, really awesome news are we've got some volunteers for documentation, and they already started over the weekend.
Awesome.
Somebody's even creating a screencast series.
Nice.
So the first one is out, which starts at installing with Composer and getting the whole thing up and running. So it's decoupled GraphQL with Drupal from scratch. And then since we were got our test coverage to a level where we felt confident to challenge another outstanding task, was the library that sits at the heart of the GraphQL module, which was kind of there is another library that wasn't in a place to really be used back when we started, but it's actually a lot better now. So we started experimenting how it would work out to replace the library.
Wow.
And at least the results look very promising, because we have like magnitudes of performance increase.
Wow.
A hugely a godlike developer experience, because it like gives you real error messages and exceptions, what's wrong with your schema, or which field was not able to resolve properly. And
what's its name?
It's GraphQL PHP by WebOnyx.
Aptly named.
I think I might have seen some tears or stars in your eyes, Philip.
Yeah.
You were looking so happy while you were saying that.
No,
Useful error messages.
Yes. It matters. It matters.
Yeah, and it also can do stuff like lazy schema, like just loading the plugins the very query needs that you get. And so there would be a lot of potential, and we're currently investigating if we can pull this off still.
Wow, yeah, that sounds like pretty much the equivalent of open heart surgery on your module, which you can do because you know how it's supposed to work thanks to your test coverage,
Yes.
which is what you said.
Test
So that's
coverage.
very cool.
Got ready, just not a moment too early.
Well, I have to say that's actually very impressive. That the fact that you're even able to do this or attempt to do this, that's like really encouraging, I think. Because
yeah.
if the test coverage is not there, like that would be the most scary thing imaginable that you could start doing.
It would be impossible, yeah.
Yeah. So,
but now, at least since this is the library with far better support, a far larger user base, I think it would be a more responsible thing to do to release a module that depends on the more stable base library.
Yeah, if I can give you kind of a word of experience with maintaining the simple auth module, which is also based on one of several popular libraries of auth, I would say that just it's important to go with the right library. And I would support moving to that. And I'm really happy that we decided to use that one for auth too. So yeah, I can imagine why you want to replace it. I also want to say to anyone that's still watching that probably you don't need error messages because GraphQL is going to generate the schemas and they are going to be flawless for you. So that's useful for Philip, these error messages. Also that performance, wow, we have like all the cacheability metadata in place. It's working wonderfully. So it's just that one guy that's unlucky that's going to get the hit, and everything else is going to be cached. So pretty cool that Drupal has all these other features that work out for you. So yeah, and sorry, that was my forceful wrap up because I need to be somewhere else.
Nicely done, sir.
Anyways,
right.
it was a great sync. Bye, everyone.
Yep, it was. Bye, everyone.
See you guys.
Bye.